And now, Dr. Bell.
Sure. Morning, everyone. Good morning. We're going to start off by having a mantra exercise that you're all going to help me recite. We don't have an overhead, so we're going to see how well we can do with you just looking and hearing. But this is called the Gayatri Mantra. It's a very popular mantra, over 3,000 years old, found in the Vedas, which are some of the earliest texts, or really the earliest scripture that are revered by Hindus today. Not memorized or even really read by all of them, but at least revered. And so the way that this mantra goes is I'll recite a line, and then you'll recite after me, and we'll go through all four together. How's that sound? Okay? So first line goes, and it's a bit sing-songy. This is how Vedic scripture kind of works. Om Bhur-Bhuvah-Svah. Om Bhur-Bhuvah-Svah. Next one's a little bit tougher. Tat Savatur Varenyam. Tat Savatur Varenyam. Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi. Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi. Dhiyo yo naha prachodayat. Dhiyo yo naha prachodayat. Very good.
Could you say the whole thing?
You want me to say the whole thing?
Yeah.
Okay. The whole thing is Om Bhur-Bhuvah-Svah Tat Savatur Varenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo yo naha prachodayat. Now, an actual Vedic reciter does a much better job than I do, and so I'm going to actually play how it would be recited in a much more kind of melodic fashion in traditional Vedic ceremonies. Let's see how well my sound carries. I'll lift this up more. There we go. Alright, let's try this. It's not working at all. Okay. We'll try from here. There we go.
Singing from Samaveda.
Everyone hear that?
Samavediya Gayatri. Om Tattvavidam Varenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo yo nah prachodayat.
Yeah, I can't do that. But I think we did quite a good job. Okay, so my talk today is on the origins of Hinduism, and I'm going to try to keep it short and sweet because it is history, and history can be kind of dry, a little bit. And I'm also going to try to condense over 3,000 years of Hindu history into that. I know, impossible. But my goal is to at least make you aware of the major trends in early Hindu history and all of the major ideas that we find in Hinduism today, where they came from. Right? There's a lot of very important core beliefs in Hinduism, such as reincarnation, the idea of samsara, as it's called in Sanskrit, this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Karma, we've all heard of karma, that's made its way well into Western society now. And dharma, as well as moksha, this notion of moksha, which means liberation, or it could also be interpreted as enlightenment. Okay, so we'll see where a lot of these ideas come from. The first thing I want to kind of make you aware of is basically what we mean by India, at least in these historical contexts. And when we think of India today, we think of the country of India, which was founded officially in 1947 after British colonialism failed, or sort of ended at that point. At that time, we have this nation of, or the Republic of India, as it's called, and then we have all these surrounding countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan. All of these are independent nations now, but way back in the time that we're talking about, 2500 BCE, before the Common Era, the whole Indian subcontinent was one large kind of, even nation isn't really an apt word, but it was all one kind of culture, right? Or really a collection of very diverse cultures, right? No solid kingdoms, no solid nations or states or empires. None of that really started happening until much later than that. So when we look at a map of India way back when, all we're looking at is geographical designations. We're looking at the Ganges River in the north of India. We're looking at the Indus River in the northwest of India, which is in now modern-day Pakistan. Right? So all those modern national boundaries don't exist, 3,000-4,000 years ago. All right? So that's kind of where we're dealing with. And the main chronology, if I were to give you 4 major periods in the growth of Hinduism, we have this indigenous culture that existed along the Indus River Valley, which is, again, pretty much cuts right through modern-day Pakistan. So if you know where Pakistan is, you know where the Indus River Valley is. All right? Cuts right through. There was an indigenous culture around this area for about 1,000 years, from about 3,500 to 2,500 to 1,500 BCE, give or take. Right? It was actually a very cosmopolitan society. Did you have a question? No? Okay. All right. So yeah, for about 1,000 years, this culture existed along the Indus River Valley, communicated with smaller communities going all along the western coast of India, of the Indian subcontinent, and even some of those artifacts that are associated with this culture were found as far north as Mesopotamia. Right? It's quite impressive. Beyond that Indus Valley civilization, as we call it, or Harappan culture, either one works, it's synonymous. Once that started to fade away, die out, then we start to get the Indo-Aryan migration. We've all heard the term of Aryans. These are the real Aryans, all right? Not what was going on in Germany in the 1940s. All right, the real Aryans were this linguistic group, this sort of ethnic community that slowly migrated down into northwestern India and kind of took over where this indigenous community of Harappans once held sway. And they kind of started to assimilate from about 1750 to about 1300 BCE. Once they kind of got settled, then we have what's called the Vedic period from about 1700 to 600 BCE. And again, I'll go through each of these a bit more in detail. I'm just giving you the broad chronology. All right? And this Vedic period is exactly what we find in the Vedas, the sacred scripture associated with the Aryans, composed by the Aryans. Right? And what we heard, what we just recited ourselves, the Gayatri Mantra, that is found within the Vedas. All right? So we have a lot of great information about Vedism, Vedic practice. Then we have this era called Brahmanism by many scholars, called Brahmanism, from about 600 BCE. That's actually incorrect. That should be 600 BCE to 600 CE. I say 600 BCE to 600 BCE. That's a slight mistake on my part. So for a good 1,200 years, right, 1,200 year period, 600 BCE to 600 CE. And this is when this community of Vedic practitioners started to assimilate into North Indian culture. And again, we'll look at that a bit more in detail. And then finally, only about 1,500 years ago, around 600 CE, right, do we get what's called kind of devotional Hinduism. And this looks the most like Hinduism we have today. So while Hinduism does show that its tradition goes back thousands and thousands of years, how it looks today really doesn't start to come out of the woodwork until about 1,500 years ago. Right? And it's all because of the beliefs and practices that we associate with Hinduism today didn't really become standardized until that period. Okay? So we'll look at those in a bit more detail. Here are some pictures we got about returning to Harappan culture. That's really around this area in green. If you see the Indian subcontinent right here, here is modern-day boundaries of Pakistan, and then the Indus River going right through. And then we have all these cities, one of which is called Harappa, which is why we call it the Harappan culture. Another one is called Mohenjo-Daro. We have Mehrgarh and Lothal. And this whole area in green were the major extent of this indigenous civilization. The earliest civilization that we know about to exist with any certainty in India. Right? Going all the way back to prehistoric times. So we have a lot of great information archaeologically. We have all these wonderful seals with animals on them. We have all these amazing cities that were clearly very well planned. Very well planned. It's not like DC or Boston, right? Where the lines are just all over the place. No, this was clearly put down on paper, or at least on some kind of structure, before it was put down in architecture. All right? The only problem is we do have what seems to be a language in these seals or along these seals, but no one can read it. We don't know what this says. And scholars have tried, there have been some guesses, there's no scholarly consensus on what the language is that's being used or what they mean. So there's a lot that we don't know about the civilization. We don't know who their major gods were, if they had gods. We don't know, or if they had one god or no gods. We don't know anything about the culture or the religion other than sort of the ghosts of what archaeology show us, right? The kind of remnants. We have some sense that looking at their city, the way that it was planned, looking at the remains in various houses in various parts of those cities, it seemed that there was some degree of caste segregation, right? Where farmers lived in one area because that's where all the farmers' tools were found. Clay workers lived in another area because that's where all the pot shards were found. So we have some sense that there was some kind of community segregation going on that early. But beyond that, we know very, very little. There's a lot of speculation over the Harappan culture because there's no written record for us to really refer to. Right? There's no Rosetta Stone either, for us to kind of try to understand the writing. So that Harappan culture, it lasted for a good 1,000 years. And yet we know next to nothing about it, again, other than what little archaeological evidence we have. We also don't know quite what happened to them. They seem to have died out. For the longest time, scholars thought the Aryans, when they started coming down into northwestern India, that they just conquered the area. And there's some suggestion that this may have been true to some extent, because there are weapons that start to get found in the archaeological record that we don't see earlier than that. Right? We don't see weaponry in Harappan culture very frequently. We see more like farming tools. Right? We see things like that. And all of a sudden, as the Aryans come down, we see weapons being used. So for the longest time, scholars thought that it was just conquest, plain and simple. And yet when we look a bit closer at the ecology at the time, when we look at sort of the genetic record as it has evolved, and now we have some of that scientific evidence to go off of, we find that there are probably multiple reasons that this grand, millennium-old civilization just died out. It was probably been due partly to the Aryan conquest, or at least some degree of Aryan migration. It was probably due to geographical issues. Rivers, they move over time. And so as the rivers move away, so do cities start to crumble because they no longer have that lifeblood. Right? So that could have happened. They could have over-farmed. We see some evidence of some of the cities over-farming and using the soil before it's allowed to replenish, as we now know that you need to do. So one reason or another, the civilization started to crumble, right? And the remnants of it probably moved down further into the south of the Indian subcontinent, making way for the Aryans to take hold. And that's what we have, this Indo-Aryan migration coming down from the Central Asian steppes, maybe a little bit further afield from Iran or from Russia, multiple groups over periods of hundreds of years making their way down into the Indus River Valley region. Okay? And that's actually kind of where we get our term for a lot of different words. Iran, for instance, is cognate with Adian. The Ire of Ireland, cognate with Adian. And because that word actually literally means the noble ones, or the civilized ones. Right? So we get a lot so it's related to the Latin language. Indo-European language and Latin are very closely related. So Sanskrit, the language of the Aryans, and Latin have a lot of cognates between them. It's actually kind of scary how much they have in common. Yeah. But Sanskrit's harder. Mark my words, it's harder. The Aryans for themselves were not traditionally pastoralists, the way that we see in the Indus Valley civilization. They were nomads, or they were semi-nomadic. So they moved around a lot. And they were very big on animal husbandry. Right? So there wasn't a lot of dealing with plant cultivation, except for one in particular, which I'll talk about. It was mainly having to do with horses and with cows. And cows especially start to become very sacred because of what their body can offer in so many ways. They offer meat, they offer milk, they offer clothing in the form of their skin, right? Leather. So this is where you start to get this notion of the cow being quite sacred in Hindu belief and practice, right? This early on. Horsemanship becomes also very significant, although that starts to fade away when the Aryans actually start to settle down. Right? So they finally come into the Indus River Valley region and they settle down for good. All right, what were some of the important things to the Aryans? Well, the nice thing about the Aryans is we know what they believed because we have the Vedas. Those are the Aryans' texts, are the Vedas. We didn't have that for the Indus Valley Civilization. We don't know much about them because of that. We can only trust the archaeological record. But for the Aryans who came down into that area and kind of took over, we have their texts, the Vedas, written in a language that we can read, Sanskrit. And what this tells us is that they were very obsessed with an intoxicating drink called soma. There was some speculation that maybe this was a mushroom or some kind of hallucinatory beverage. This was very popular theory in the 70s, I think, for reasons that we all understand. Now, more recent scholarship is suggesting maybe it was more of a caffeinated type of beverage. Maybe it was more invigorating rather than intoxicating. Either way, it seemed to come from some kind of plant. We still don't know which. We don't know what kind of plant it was. But when you pressed the stalk, the juice that came out of it, that was poured from it, would be mixed with warm milk and drunk for an invigorating kind of beverage. So we have that. They have a fire ritual called homa, and those words are cognate, soma and homa, they're related. And oftentimes that beverage, that soma, would be offered into the fire during this Vedic fire sacrifice. There's an importance put on sacrifice in Vedic ritual because of that. And in fact, when you see a Vedic fire sacrifice, and it's still practiced today in Hindu communities by Brahmins, the priestly class of Hindus, you find this very elaborate ritual space planned out. It's supposed to represent the cosmos, but in a microcosmic fashion. Right? It even is supposed to represent the human body, or sort of the primordial man, from whose body all of the universe came from. Right? So there's a lot of great Vedic belief and practice that we now understand thanks to Vedic texts, thanks to the Vedas. We know that there's a collection of Vedic gods. I won't go through all of them, but some of the most important include Indra, who is the god of war, and often considered the king of the gods. There's Agni, the god of fire, who is the priest of the gods, and who you have to go through to get to all the other gods. And that's exactly why fire Vedic sacrifices are so important. You have to go through the fire god himself to make praises and offerings to all the other gods. And then there's another important one named Varuna, who is the god of morality. He's sort of the arbiter of truth. And he is the arbiter of this word in Sanskrit called Ritta, which means morality or ethical goodness, and it's where our word right comes from. It's cognate with that word. Yeah. There's also an importance put on sacred sound. So the very recitation of sacred sounds comes from the Vedas. That's why we get symbols like Om. If anyone's recognized this symbol, that's Om, right? And we recited it earlier. That's why sound is so important, because you are speaking it out to the universe and you can't take it back, right? Once it's out there, it is indestructible, it is permanent, it cannot be returned. And so when you make praises to the divinities, when you make praises to the gods in Vedic fire sacrifices, or in various prayers, it's always out there. It's always out there. That's where that importance comes from. It came from the audience and found in the Vedas. So what are the Vedas? Well, there are 4 major texts that make up the Vedas, right? And all these little details you don't need to worry about. The earliest one is called the Rig Veda. Rig Veda. And it literally means praise. Veda literally means knowledge or wisdom, and our word wisdom and Veda are cognate. Veda, Veda. Wit may be a bit more accurate to that. Wit, Veda. Right? So there's a cognate there as well for where we get our word for wisdom. So you could say the wisdom of praise is maybe how you could translate Rig Veda. And it literally is just a collection of hymns to the gods, to the various Vedic gods. When you offer them, there's some mythology in there, but for the most part, it's just simple verses of praise at its core. The other Vedas, or 2 other Vedas, are just variants of that first one. So we have the Sama Veda, which is just the Rig Veda set to song. We have the Yajur Veda, which is the Rig Veda set to ritual structure. So very useful for those fire sacrifices that the priests are doing all the time. And then finally we have the Atharva Veda. That's the most distinct. It doesn't have a lot of the Rig Veda in it. It's mostly full of black magic and magical spells. Yeah, very pragmatic, very practical, right? For getting your animals back, or making your family healthy, or maybe attacking an enemy, you know, in another community. So that's what the Vedas are for the most part. Praises to gods and pragmatic practices, right? So for the most part, it discusses cosmology, right? Cosmogony, the origin of the universe, eschatology, the end of things, not a lot on that actually, and the gods. Its primary concerns, the Vedas' primary concerns, are daily life, health, wealth, and happiness, right? Appeasing the gods, very important because they're usually responsible for your health, wealth, or happiness, or lack thereof. And sacrificial purity, right? So making sure that the sacrifice is done appropriately, done effectively, right? In order to ensure your health, your wealth, and your happiness. There's almost little to no discussion of the afterlife in the Vedas. It's actually almost completely absent. There's a little bit in later recensions added to the Vedas, but there's almost no talk of an afterlife. There's no talk of reincarnation in the Vedas. There's no talk of karma, really, except as ritual action. Karma, the word karma, literally means action. That's all it means, just doing something. And it starts to take on this sort of coloring as time goes on, but its earliest meaning was ritual action. That was it. Didn't have to do with doing good or bad things, morally speaking. Right? So all these concepts we've come to associate with Hinduism now weren't there in the Vedas. They weren't there. They don't come about until we get to the Brahmanic era. And the gist of what happens in the Brahmanic era is that community of Aryans that started to set up shop in the northwest in Pakistan, right, in the Indus River Valley, they start to migrate slowly down into northern India where they start to accumulate along the Ganges River. You've all heard of the Ganges River, right? Yeah. So that's where those communities start to finally get settled, is along the Ganges. And that's a 1,000-year process. That happens from about 1500 BCE to 500 BCE. All right? So slowly, gradually, over 1,000 years, these communities start to set up shop all along the Ganges. And kingdoms start to get formed. No longer just this sort of rural village living. Now we start to see cosmopolitanism. Now we start to see a vibrant merchant class start to rise up. We start to see the development of money, of currency, not just bartering. We start to see communities working together along networks and roads that start to form between these kingdoms. So a lot of vibrancy happens. And this, of course, is the result of population increase. Right? They've been living well, they've got a surplus of crops, similar thing to what happened in European history once upon a time. So now you've got people forming cities, communicating with each other a lot more rapidly, trading goods, trading ideas. Right? Ideas start to spread. Cities become the centers for philosophers, for religious leaders, for politicians, for people of all stripes to mingle and work together. People can become more independent from their family communities because they can travel farther and wider. Right? This happens over this 1,000-year period called the Brahmanic era. And the reason why it's called the Brahmanic era, and Rabindranath Tagore's hymn is very much in line with this, we start to see the arrival of the last major strata of the Vedas, and they're called the Upanishads. This collection of texts called the Upanishads that start to bring up this notion called Brahman. Brahman is this supreme deity of sorts, but even deity is too limiting. It's the supreme. So Rabindranath Tagore's hymn speaks to that. I'll put my string in with yours, right? That is becoming one with Brahman. There's this notion of a self or a soul that starts to arise in this era, and that self is called Atman, the Atman. That is your individual soul, the Atman. And Brahman is the supreme reality. And our soul and that supreme reality are ultimately one. Right? That arises in this time period with these texts called the Upanishads. Right? So now even the beliefs start to evolve and change, and people start to lose a little bit of faith in the old Vedas. They start to see some limitations with them. They no longer really apply to urban life anymore, urban concerns anymore. That was more relevant to village life, to pastoral living, right? So they're no longer quite so relevant. And what you have by the 8th to 6th century BCE, through these texts called the Upanishads, is the development of new pan-Indian ideas, right? Ideas that are no longer just found in one community or another community, but that are shared by all communities because of these networks between kingdoms and these ideas that are being shared between states all over northern India. And these new pan-Indian religious notions challenge the traditional Vedic system. You start to see the introduction of new ideas like samsara. There used to be this vague notion of a heaven or a heavenly realm in the Vedas. Again, very, very little mention. But there seemed to be some suggestion that the righteous, the most righteous among us, would go and be in that heaven. And then the unrighteous would maybe be torn asunder by demons. And they would no longer exist. They would fall into oblivion. Well, now, people start to doubt. Maybe even heaven isn't forever. Nothing seems to be forever in this world. There are seasons. Things change all the time. So maybe that is true of heaven as well. Maybe instead of staying in heaven forever, you eventually come right back into the world. And that's where reincarnation starts to enter the picture. This notion of samsara. Samsara literally means a wheel, or circle. And it is this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth to which all beings are victim to. Right? And what pushes us through this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth is this new notion of karma, this mechanism whereby our quality of life and our next life, our rebirth, are determined by our ritual as well as our now moral actions. Karma starts to take on a moral tenor to it, moral action. Right? And the idea of it is actually, again, quite, I would say, logical for the time period. With cities came epidemics, came disease, came death of a new scale that people just couldn't find any justice for. Right? People would have sort of a crisis of conscience. All these new maladies that never were encountered, people started to ask, why do good things happen to bad people? Why do bad things happen to good people? And the explanation was, good people who are suffering now must have done something bad in a past life. And bad people who are getting away literally with murder or with theft must have done something good in a past life. That's the only way they can make sense of it, of all this injustice. How do we make sense of this suffering brought on good people and reward brought on those who should be punished? Karma. Karma. Right? They reap what they sow from past lives. So you can start to see how these ideas suddenly just come out of the woodwork because of this urbanization going on around the Ganges River. And finally, in relation to samsara is this notion called moksha. Moksha, literally it means to unfetter or to untie. And you are untying yourself, you are untying your Atman from this depressing round of birth, death, and rebirth, this round of samsara. So moksha is liberation from samsara, the ultimate goal of religious effort. Right? And this is all still part of Hinduism today. All still prevalent in Hinduism today. Finally, the last major element, you start to get this notion called dharma. And you find dharma being talked about in these grand epics. Not in the Vedas, not in the Upanishads, but in these epic stories like the Ramayana, like the Bhagavad Gita. Has anyone heard of the Bhagavad Gita? Yeah. So that's like, okay, good. Most people have. That's like only a part of chapter 6 of a much larger book, a much larger Indian epic called the Mahabharata, which is about 10 times larger than the Odyssey and the Iliad combined. It's a big book. And if you, there's a translation of it, a condensed translation, and that is already like 1,000 pages in English. It's a big book. So the Bhagavad Gita makes up a very, very small portion of that. But in these epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita, as part of that, you start to see this notion of dharma, of moral action, of righteous duty. What is expected of you in your time and in your place and in your community. Right? And this idea starts to flourish. And in fact, in the Raghupati, a lot of those terms were various labels for King Rama, who is the main character of the Ramayana. So it said Raja Rama at one point. I was reading it. And that's King Rama. It was saying Sita. That's his wife, Sita. It was saying Ishwara Allah. In that sense, it's referring to God in the term of Allah. And Ishwara means Lord. So Lord Allah. So it's great to see all these kinds of concepts being worked together into these various hymns that we've used today. So that is where this idea of dharma comes out of. What you also start to see is this notion of devotion. Bhakti in the Sanskrit. About 1,500 years ago, give or take, there is this new movement that starts in the South India and finally actually starts to impact North India. And that is devotion to the divine. devotion to gods, seeing the gods themselves as incarnations of Brahman, as incarnations of the supreme divine. And you see that actually fairly early on, even in the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna is the main god of the Bhagavad Gita, and he is seen as a form of Brahman. As a form of Brahman that you can actually relate to. Because when you read about Brahman in the Upanishads, it's very airy, it's very abstract, it's kind of hard to conceptualize. When you get to the Bhagavad Gita, Brahman is right there with you, in the form of Krishna. And so that idea really takes off 1,500 years ago. And you have suddenly all the various gods start to be seen as a form of Brahman. It just depends on what community you belong to. So if you are a follower of Shiva, if you are specifically a worshiper of Shiva, then you believe that Shiva is. But there's a more distinct term called henotheism. H-E-I-N-O, theism. And that is acknowledging all the gods, but worshiping one in particular. Right? Or worshiping them in their order. So you can be a Vaishnava, that is a worshiper of Vishnu. See Vishnu as ultimately Brahman. But you'll still worship Shiva during his festivals. You'll still worship Durga during her festivals. You'll still go to goddess temples when you feel like it, depending on the time of year. So you are accepting all of the other gods. But one in particular is the most incarnate of the Supreme Ultimate, of Brahman. And that idea of bhakti, of devotion, really starts to come out of the woodwork where you get all these songs. We were playing around with one of them earlier today. That's called the bhajan. Bhajan in Hindi. And these are songs of devotion to show your connection with a special deity, right? There are all these various ways of expressing your devotion, and I'll go to the next one. Nowadays, the most popular way of showing that devotion is through puja. Has anyone heard of puja before? Heard that term, puja? Puja is basically worship or reverence of the divine. And it can be as simple as having a little home altar where you have a little statue of Ganesha, right, the little elephant-headed god, or maybe of Vishnu, or maybe of Shiva, and you will give offerings to that divinity. You will put sweet-smelling, perfumed water in front of them. You will light candles to them. You will offer fruits, simple fruits, in front of them, almost as you would treat a revered guest. Right? That's the idea. It can be as simple as that, daily devotions at a home altar. You could go to a local village temple and make offerings there to that shrine. Or you could take pilgrimage to huge temple complexes halfway across the country. The pilgrimage itself is a form of devotion, right? It takes days, maybe weeks, or even months. And then once you get there, you pay obeisance to the divinity. You see the god or the goddess, and the god or goddess sees you. And that is called darshan, envisioning the divine, darshan. Right? So there's supposed to be this interplay between the divine and yourself. And then you go back home. Right? And that return home becomes part of bhakti, becomes part of devotion as well. So this is how Hindus today express that. So we see all the major elements of Hinduism found in this history. We see the development of samsara, rebirth, reincarnation. We see the development of karma. Good actions result in good fruit. Right? Bad actions result in bad fruit. We see the idea of moksha, liberation, becoming one with Brahman. And we see ideas like dharma, your proper duty, coming about later through the epics, and eventually devotion itself, bhakti. Bhakti, one's devotion to the divine, whatever form that divine takes. Vishnu, Shiva, the goddess. All of this is what looks like Hinduism today. And so to kind of return to that previous slide at the end here, these are the four major aims of a good Hindu life. And all of these are acceptable, depending on your stage of life. So when you are an adult and you are married, you can experience pleasure, kama, in all of its forms, sensual in any forms, in good food, in good company, right? So that is totally okay. In fact, has anyone heard of the Kama Sutra? Yeah. That's where that kama comes from. Kama means pleasure. Yeah. So the Pleasure Sutra. That's okay if you're an adult and you're married. Artha, success. If you have a good business, that's okay. It's okay to work towards the best to make good money for your family. Right? Again, within time. If you're an adult, that's the best. If you're a child, if you're a student, it's good to be celibate, and it's good to listen to your elders. That's the time for that. Dharma, right action, that's good all the time. But it just changes what is determined to be your right action during what stage of life you're in and what caste you're in. We've heard of this caste system in Hinduism. Brahmins are the priestly class, Kshatriyas are the royal class, Vaishyas are the merchant class, and Shudras are the servant class. And then technically outside of the caste system are these untouchables, who deal with the most polluting things. And there's a lot of controversy about that. It's technically outlawed in India today, but it's still very much socioeconomically in practice, especially in the village. And then finally, moksha, liberation. That's good at the end of your life. You know, when you're focused on religious pursuits, you can pursue, you can endeavor to achieve liberation from the round of rebirth. That's it in a nutshell. Any questions now, or shall we wait?
We'll wait.
We'll wait. Okay.
I was like,